lucky to be joined by Sacha Thompson. Sacha is the founder of the Equity Equation, which is a diversity coaching and consulting firm based in the Washington, D.C. area. And it centers around equity and the rebuilding of more diverse and inclusive workspaces by focusing on the practical steps that companies can take to balance the equation. She received her BA in sociology, concentrating on cultural diversity and ethnicity from here at the college. And then she went on to earn her Master's of Education in Educational Policy, Planning, and Leadership from the School of Education here at William & Mary as well. And then she went on to earn her Master's of Business Administration from Johns Hopkins University, where she focused on management and marketing. And then before founding the Equity Equation, Sacha gained experience in many different fields, including higher education, communications, marketing, technology, and consulting, just to name a few. And so taking from these experiences, Sacha guides executives and leaders through that important dialogue about DEI in the work environments and in workplaces, and coaches them to the necessary long-term changes that develop institutional cultures of DEI. So Sacha, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Just to get started, I wanted to ask you, how are you doing as a person and as a founder in this time that we've all kind of found ourselves in for about a year now?
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you. It's always wonderful to do stuff for the college. So, how am I doing right now? It's interesting because I made the decision to leave the corporate space in the middle of this pandemic, right?
Yeah.
So, most people are like, okay, why in the world would you do that? But I also knew that the talents and skills that I had in the diversity space, I could do so much more outside of where I was. And so I thought it was the perfect opportunity to do that. And some of the companies that I'd been talking to already were reaching out saying, hey, can you help us with this? We're not quite sure how to approach the situation. So it was just a perfect time for me to kind of step out and do that in the comfort of my own home. So this virtual space has worked out well for me because I've been able to do conferences in the UK and, in all over the world, really, from this spot. So that's been beautiful, and not having to live out of an airport like I've done for some other jobs.
Yeah, that's awesome. So now thinking back to your time at William & Mary, how do you think it shaped your entrepreneurial journey and the founding of the Equity Equation?
Honestly, when you first reached out about this, my gut reaction was like, this is a 360, right? Like, this is where it all started for me. I was a sociology major focused on ethnicity and cultural diversity. I worked at the time, it was called the Office of Multicultural Affairs as an undergraduate. And so I was really able to learn more about cultures and the nuances of culture during my time there. Fast forward a little bit, everyone's like, okay, what are you going to do with a sociology degree? Like, you're not going to do anything with that. And what's this culture thing nobody's thinking about or talking about? But it's been something that has been an undercurrent in my career throughout my time. So I really honestly owe credit to the college and my experience there for laying this foundation for me and giving me a solid foundation, honestly, in able to do this work, being able to do this work.
That's awesome, yeah. Especially because I feel like that definitely is talked about more than it probably was a few years ago. So, talking more about your work, on your Twitter, you discuss that DEI is a workplace, workforce, and marketplace challenge, which is also reflected in your company framework. So would you be able to explain what this means and how, as students, we might be able to apply this as we enter into the workforce and potentially build our own businesses in the future?
Yeah. So most of the time, or usually what you see, is diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of being housed in HR. And there's a little bit of a challenge to that right now. But it's always been this approach of the people that work for us, right? And so we're going to keep it in HR because it's about recruiting and retention, sometimes promotion. And it's kind of just been housed there. Where DEI is going now, or actually has been going for quite some time, is how does this impact the people that you're recruiting, the people that you touch outside of your company? How does this touch the industry? How are you impacting the industry with this? How are you impacting your customers? And so when I talk about the workforce, that's really that industry piece. That's really, how are you engaging in these conversations? How are you reaching out to those that don't have opportunities or are being left out for some reason, right? Be it race, gender, disability, whatever it is. And excuse me, what can you do to mitigate those barriers, right? As a company, and how does that fit into your company mission, values, goals, et cetera? So it really is something that should be part of the company DNA and not just something that's housed in HR. And again, with the marketplace, you're starting to see companies really get pushed back, right? If they're making statements, but then their products are not aligning with those statements. And so as entrepreneurs, one of the things that I think is most important is truly understanding how DEI can shape who you're reaching out to. Because there are markets that are not tapped that have spend, right? Like they have spending potential. And so how can you provide services that can meet the needs of those that are not being met?
That's awesome. Just, I'm curious, like in the past year, have you shifted or pivoted how you approach DEI coaching at all, just in light of, everything that's been happening for the past year, year and a half? Or it's been occurring for a while, but has been in light for the last year and a half. Yeah.
Yeah. So on the coaching side, what's been interesting is I really have two types of clients. One are usually individuals that are underrepresented in some way, shape, or form that are mid-career, and they're hitting the barriers that most folks that are underrepresented hit: racism, sexism, some type of discrimination in some way. And so it's how do you help them move beyond some of those barriers, right? And sometimes that's a toxic environment. You might want to go, right? And creating an exit plan. But sometimes it's like really just learning certain skills in order to navigate. The other clients that I have are executives that have really great intentions, but have blind spots. And so they're trying to figure out, okay, what can I do to be a better ally in this space? Or how can I, understand what's happening because it's not happening to me. And so I'm noticing more of those conversations starting to happen around identifying blind spots, identifying ways for people to get out of their own way, really, when they're talking about diversity and inclusion, especially with employees, but more so around the marketplace, because they're noticing and they're realizing that their customers are pushing back.
That's awesome that you've been able to see that shift and that, that conversation is changing too.
Yeah.
What would your advice be to students in being more conscious in cultivating, an inclusive class or university environment, especially, within an online space as well?
Say that question again.
Do you have any advice for students in being more conscious about cultivating, more inclusive and diverse, spaces within our university and at William and Mary?
Yeah, I think take whatever courses you can, but take courses that are going to challenge your viewpoint, right? Because that's where you learn when you're in that place of discomfort. That's where you start to grow and at least see other perspectives of things. You may not change your mind, but at least you can see another perspective. And I think that that's what's most important in this space. Also, one of the things that I was able to do when I was there was sitting in some of the student organizations that weren't the organizations that I was a member of, if that makes sense, right? So I was able to sit in some of the Asian student organization meetings and events and programs and really get to learn about culture in a way that I don't think I would have been able to do outside of that environment. And so lean into those opportunities, but then also have a level of cultural humility in that learning, right? Because nobody knows everything. I've been in this space for a long time. I'm not going to tell y'all exactly how long, but every day I'm learning something new, right? And so it's just being open to that learning. And when someone pushes back, take that as a way to continue your education and learning.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really great advice. I love that opportunity discovery there of, going into, different spaces, maybe ones you're not comfortable with. I think that's really cool. And kind of off script, but I'm curious, were there any like specific courses or any other experiences that really challenged your viewpoint that you can, think of right off the top of your head or anything?
Two things. Two. One was a summer class that I took that was ethnocultural psychology. It was just an elective offered one summer. And I think that was probably the most impactful course that I took there, because it was the psychology behind understanding different cultures and why people act and react the way that they do, even if they're within the same culture. Right.
Mhm.
So, yeah, that was just a fascinating class that I still reference quite a bit some years later. I think the other was more of a leaning into comfort, discomfort. And I don't know if this professor is still there, but there was a sociology professor, Satoshi Ito, that was there that taught Blacks in American society. And the fact that it was this Asian American man that was teaching a Blacks in American society class threw people off,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
But to understand him and to know, like, this is the research that he had been doing for years. He was probably one of the top um, researchers in the country on that topic. And so I learned so much from him because of his perspective
Mhm.
of doing that research. So those were two things that really stood out for me.
Awesome. And now for our question voted on by the audience. It was a really close one. It was like by one vote. If you could go back and change something or add anything to your William and Mary experience, what would it be and why?
That was the one question I didn't have an answer for.
Oh no, improvisation.
Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, I had a great experience. Now, I'm not going to say everything was perfect because there were some tensions that had happened before my freshman year that we kind of walked into as freshmen. But I learned a lot about speaking up for myself.
Mhm.
I learned a lot about leading while I was there. I was president of the Black Student Organization for a while. Um, I was just very active on campus. And I learned so much from that aspect of things, probably more so than I did in the classroom a little bit, because I was able to talk to leaders. When we had folks come on campus, I was able to meet and talk with them. Um, two people, two people that come to mind was or Betty Shabazz. She came to campus and I was able to have dinner with her. Um, and the highlight of that was she didn't want to go anywhere in Williamsburg other than Captain George's. And I'm like, really? Like, in all the places in Williamsburg, you want to go to Captain George's? Okay. But had just a phenomenal time with her and Bobby Seale from the Black Panthers, and having dinner with him and spending some time with him. So I look back and I cannot say that there'll be anything that I would change. I mean, I was there for 6 years, 2 degrees. So I loved Williamsburg, and I loved, being there and learning all that I can, but also being allowed to challenge as well too.
Yeah, that's really awesome. I'm glad you had a really great experience, and I think that that's a really great answer too. So for my last question, we already have some questions in the chat, but for my last question, I just wanted to ask you. I always ask our founders, So, based on your founding experience and your entrepreneurial journey, which one of our pillars of entrepreneurial thinking do you think is the most beneficial when building a business or scaling an idea? And I just threw them in the chat as well in case you need to look at them, but
Look,
there's quite a few.
because knowing me, I've like all of them are. Um, I think highly of collaboration, especially as a founder starting out. I have lots of partnerships with folks. As a matter of fact, right before this call, I reached out to a friend, like, hey, I have a client that needs X, Y, and Z. I don't have that. I'm going to create something. Can you take a look at it? Right. So having someone that you can kind of bounce ideas off of is always helpful as you're trying to build your portfolio. Tolerance for ambiguity. Yes. Yes. Huge. And I think a lot of people learned that with this pandemic, right? Like you had to pivot quickly. I think the beauty for me was I built my company in a pandemic. So I kind of had that safety net there already. And so when we open back up, right, it's how does that change things? Do I want to get back in travel? And just to give you all an idea, when I was in a corporate space, was it 2018? I was on a plane 85% of the time.
Wow.
Right. So to go from that to barely being home like 3 or 4 days a month to being at home 24/7 is a pivot. And so you have to make the decision of like, how do you want your business to scale and what does that look like? Right. Do you need to do that? Can you lean on others to help you do that? That's all part of that ambiguity and trying to figure things out and just being flexible.
Yeah. Awesome. I think that leaves us in a really great place to start our Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and read the question in the chat. But if you have a question after that one, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away or send it in the chat and I can read it aloud for you if you're more comfortable with that. But Taylor Robertson asks, do clients tend to come to you mid or post crisis, or is it more so already conscientious C-suites that approach you to work with their companies in a preventative workplace culture establishing manner?
It's a great question, Taylor. You know what? It's interesting. Most of the folks that have come to me have done some type of work before, right? They've done unconscious bias training or something internally, and they're realizing now, okay, we need more than this. And so what I'm doing is finding organizations that just don't know what that next step is. So I'm kind of helping them, guiding them through that. So I have a 12-point framework that I provide them, also an assessment to kind of start them off, right? This is where you are around diversity, equity, and inclusion in your organization. Here's the framework. Here's some of the gaps that we're seeing. And so what's the low-hanging fruit? What can we attack right now versus this is going to take some time because this is a culture change. And so what I'm noticing with that is folks are a little hesitant because they're like, oh, this is a lot of work that we need to do. This isn't just checkbox activities that we can do. And so those that stay on board know that this is for the long haul because they're truly trying to change their company structure. That being said, what I will say is most of the companies that I do work with are small to mid-size companies.
Thank you so much for answering my question. I quite appreciate it. I also, you definitely seem like a consultant in a lot of ways. And I'm just wondering this sector of diversity and inclusion consulting, are these big firms having a section of their consulting departments that focus on this? Because it's definitely an area that I think, more and more so, is being proven. The more diverse your company is, the more profits it can reach, the more inclusive the environment in terms of retention of employees. I'm just wondering, would you be open to being acquired, or are you doing something unique that big consulting firms don't offer?
Good question. I'm starting to see more consulting firms doing that, like adding an arm of diversity and inclusion to their business or to their offerings, I probably would not want to be bought out, because I also like the freedom of that. One of the reasons why I decided to go out on my own was because I was dealing with, oddly enough, discrimination while working on a diversity and inclusion team, right? So, and it's like, it's hard to advocate for yourself when you advocate for others when you're barely advocating for yourself. And so I would rather do this work and know the stress that's coming. And like, that's a good stress, right? When it's my clients and I'm trying to help them with their problems. But the stress that I was dealing with and managing was impacting my health. And so I decided it just was not worth it.
Thank you.
David Chamberlain asks in the chat, do you use some of the bias training principles outlined in bystander intervention training?
I've seen a couple of bystander intervention training, so I'm not, if there's a specific one that you're thinking about. I do talk about using your voice in my trainings and getting people to understand that there's a fear that happens in any situation. And so helping them get past those fears. I tend to not actually do bias training, like unconscious bias trainings, because I'm of the belief that everybody knows they have bias, right? Conscious or unconscious. And so what often happens with those trainings is that then becomes an excuse, like, oh, that was an unconscious bias, I didn't know. I tend to do more things around psychological safety, right? And understanding, how do you create an environment that is psychologically safe for people to be their full authentic selves and be able to provide feedback or give their opinions without repercussions, right? And how do you create an environment that allows for that type of pushback?
Yeah, I think some of it goes a little bit further. I think with the bias intervention training, some of it is we don't even realize we have some underlying biases, and I think some of those training tools or techniques help bring it to our forefront of our mind. And hold a second, I judged somebody inappropriately, and I didn't even realize I did it. One that was used on me was you see a parent disciplining a child in Walmart. What do? Well, you don't even think about it. And when we asked the group afterwards, 80% of the group thought they were doing some form of corporal punishment. And over 90% of the group thought it was a female that was displaying the child. And it was just an assumption based off bias. So that's why I ask those questions, because I think that a lot of things we do, we're just unconscious of the way we are raised and the culture we were raised in. So I just kind of ask those questions.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I do a lot of work around assumptions and privileges, right? Because especially privilege, because most folks think like, okay, I don't have any privilege. Like, we all have earned and unearned privilege. So I often use the example of, as well, and I also use insiders and outsiders too. But I always talk about how I'm able-bodied, right? There are things that I don't even think of, like I just take for granted. But because of that, because I'm conscious of that now, what I do is I do a lot in the deaf community, right? So when I was working in tech, I worked with Deaf Kids Code. I made sure that we had ASL interpreters at our events. I even had stickers with our company name and in letters, and ASL written out. So there's certain things. But we talk about how you lend your privilege and lend it honorably. And so I think having those types of conversations kind of alleviates some of the anxiety that comes when you talk about, bias. It's just verbiage. Sometimes just makes it land a little bit softer, and folks, especially when you're using the word like privilege, people, their anxiety goes up.
Yeah, I fully understand. I have a granddaughter of color, so I'm always concerned about her future and understanding that the hurdles that she's going to have to overcome. So yeah, I understand completely.
Thanks, David.
Anasa, did I say your name correctly?
Anisha, close.
Anisa, I'm sorry. She asks, one of the things that we have discussed in our consulting classes is that the issues or problems that clients identify are usually different from the actual problem that exists in the company. So my question is two-pronged. Is this a common occurrence in your field? How do you pull out the relevant information that you need in order to provide the best solution for clients?
Yes, it's super common, which is why I usually start my work with my clients with an assessment, right? So we do this diversity, equity, and inclusion assessment that measures like burnout, psychological safety, employee engagement, and my brain is fried on the fourth one. But they get a 70-page report out of that. And usually what happens is they look at it and they're just like, this isn't what we thought. And I'm like, of course not, right? So it gives them a really good baseline, but it also creates this foundation of, okay, this is where we're starting, but there's so many opportunities here. And so that tends to shift kind of what they thought was the problem to really identifying, okay, here's some gaps, here's some things that we can do. The other piece of that is why I have that 12-point framework, because again, most folks, when they're looking at diversity and inclusion, they think of their employees, right? We need to recruit more folks. We just need to bring folks in. And one of the first questions I ask them is, okay, well, what are you doing to retain those that you have? And what are your attrition rates, right? And do that across all aspects of diversity. And most of the time they're like, what? But we want to just, count the folks that are here. It's like, yeah, but who are you promoting, right? And if you're starting to see patterns, that's something that you need to identify. So I think between that assessment and the 12-point framework, they get a really good sense of where they truly are and what some of those gaps are. And then we can start putting a plan together.
Thank you so much, Sacha, and thank you, Savannah. My curiosity was kind of coming from the fact that I understand that diversity inclusion is one, like David kind of mentioned, often a scary thing, right? But it's also very complex, much more complex than we often know. And especially when you compound that with unconscious biases, right? Which are unconscious, you don't even know that you're necessarily engaging in those things. So I was curious as to how you're kind of able to pull that information from your clients in order to give them the best solution. So that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sophia asks, with the increase in public support of companies of the BLM movement, have you seen actual change within these companies? Are they just publicly supporting the movement, or are they actually taking the steps to improve their company culture?
It's so funny you should ask that. I actually hosted a webinar in January that was like 6 months after the statements, like what's happening. And the common response was, nothing much is happening. And so it goes into this performative, we want to look good, but really don't want to do the work. And oddly enough, I'm starting, especially this week, I've started seeing a lot more pushback on those types of things, where it's, you've made these statements, and especially now what's happening in the, with the anti-Asian sentiment that's just permeated this country. You're seeing statements being pushed out, but then a lot of those conversations are not happening internally. I had a friend of mine who's still in a diversity role say the conversation within their leadership team was, is this enough of an issue for our leaders to even make a statement? Right? And I'm just like, how is it not? These are your employees. And so what I'm starting to see is this pushback of how are you dismantling systems within your organizations to ensure that these statements aren't just statements, right? And what does that look like? Some companies are thinking about that a lot. There's a lot of resistance though. And there was an article maybe 2 or 3 days ago that came out where there's a group of companies that are telling their shareholders to vote against doing racial audits of their organizations. Because if they look at that data and see exactly what their employees are dealing with, then that forces them to have to do something about it.
Thank you, Sacha. Thank you for being here with us today. I just think that with everything going on that has been going on for so many years, and just the increase in social media with the pandemic and just the wrongful injustices, that this is definitely a topic that needs to be brought up to these leaders and these companies. And it's definitely something that I hope that they are having the conversations within their teams. And is there some kind of way to like send out a program, or maybe like a lecture that companies can receive and show amongst their employees?
I mean, there's so much that's out there. I think, in all honesty, what is forcing their hands a bit is, as they're interviewing new folks to come into their organizations, people are asking them tough questions, right? What are you doing beyond the statements? How are you impacting the Latinx community here? What does it look like to be a Native American woman in your organization? Right? So they're asking like these very nuanced questions that these companies aren't necessarily prepared to answer, but then that tells you exactly where they are, right? And so people are making choices of where they want to go or how they want to show up based on kind of the responses that these organizations are getting. So I think that that pushback needs to continue, but it needs to happen on all sides, from prospective employees, current employees, in the marketplace.
Thank you.
Yeah.
These are awesome questions. Thank you everyone for being so engaged. Our next one is from David, and he says, do you think that the lack of change in BLM action steps is due to the lack of direction or focus?
Yes and no. I think that there is, if you truly look at the BLM movement and what it was founded on, there's definitely steps and actions that are in place. But what also happens is there are people that love to be a part of a movement, but not necessarily the work. They want to be out there, right? And I think that's the stuff that derails a lot of what's happening right now. And even with, excuse me, any movement, right? There's always some folks that want to say, okay, this is the direction that it needs to go in. It's going to happen with anyone. I think what's happening within organizations around this, and not just BLM, and actually I will say it with BLM because I was working in a corporate space. The question that I had was, yes, we're going to put a statement out. However, how does this impact other marginalized communities, right? Like, how do we look at this to be more inclusive? How do we challenge ourselves to be more inclusive so that we're not having to put a statement out every single time something happens, right? And not be reactive. So how are we proactive in this? And folks are like, well, nope, we need to just respond to this thing over here, right? Okay, great. So now we have this anti-Asian sentiment that's happening, and people are like, okay, well, what do we do? So we really need to be, the strategy of any organization, even if you are a founder, needs to be, what is your stance? What are your values in this? And then what does that look like, right, going forward? How are you going to move or operate in this space in your industry? And I think that's kind of where the confusion comes in, because nobody's thought about that before, right? They did not build DEI as a part of their company DNA.
Thank you, Sacha. I appreciate that.
Yep.
I actually have another question. Just, as a founder, if you can think of the most challenging roadblock that you came across. I know you started during COVID, so that's obviously a roadblock, but is there anything you can think of, and how you overcame that, so quickly?
Well, I wouldn't say I overcame it quickly. So one of the things, So my background, I did marketing for several years. I've always done some type of diversity outreach. Like that's my sweet spot. Put me on a stage in front of 20,000 people, I'm good. Like I am not shy about any of that stuff. I absolutely hate writing. It's just one of those things that I'm like, oh Lord, I don't want to have to do this. That, and I think in systems, but it doesn't necessarily always translate to what's actually out there as far as technology is concerned. So when I started my business, this is just lifting the hood, I use a program called Dubsado, right? Because it manages my calendar, schedules all of my everything, right? Invoices, all that stuff. I got into it, and I think 2 weeks in, I was just about to pull my hair out because I'm like, this is just, it's what I need, but I don't know how to set it up. And so I ended up hiring someone, like went on Fiverr and was just like, who's a Dubsado expert? Figure this out. And so I think I had to get to that point of I can't be all things to all people. Like, what is my sweet spot and what can I outsource to other folks and be okay outsourcing? Because as a founder, like you want to hold on to everything. You wear a million different hats. And I quickly had to learn, like, it is okay to ask someone else to do it. So the same person that did my Dubsado is now my virtual assistant. And I'm quickly like, hey, here you go. Take these 20 things off of my plate. And I'm okay with that. So,
yeah, thank you. That's good advice. Any other questions?
I do have one more question. So I was able to take a look at your LinkedIn profile prior to you arriving, and your consulting business is something rather new that you've started, correct? So how did you come to the decision to start this business versus, right, continuing to work in the private sector? Were there any kind of, I guess, major considerations or major changes that made you think this is the best time? And also, how did you identify that this was a need, right, in your community? How did you kind of identify that this, well, not really in your community, I guess, but just how did you identify that this was a need that companies would likely appreciate?
Yeah, loaded questions. Let's see. The first part of that question. So to be very transparent, I think I shared, I was dealing with discrimination within my last organization. And oddly enough, what was happening was I was a manager in one part of the organization when I first started there, and kind of saw how things operated. There was a transition where I ended up in HR. And if you follow me on LinkedIn, I'm not a fan of DEI in HR. Like I'm like, that's where it goes to die. It's not gonna work. This is just not the place for DEI to live. And then they put me in HR. And so I was able to see, again, some of the systems, some of the processes from that perspective. And I made the decision to leave because I saw how the system works and operated. And I was like, there was no way for me to be vocal and succeed here. And two, I had a coach at the time, and she was like, where can you make the most impact, inside or outside of the organization? And I struggled with that for a bit. And my conclusion was, I can have more impact where my voice is not silenced, right? Where I can just speak and say the things that need to be said. And so that kind of was the catalyst for me not going somewhere else, because I didn't want to go into another situation where, everything was fine and dandy for a couple of years. And then they're like, oh, nope, we need to, you're asking for too much. You're wanting us to do something that we're not willing to do. So that was kind of my decision. Why I decided to do it, when I decided to do it, in all honesty, I wanted to leave back in February of last year, right when COVID hit. And the first department that was hit was diversity and inclusion, right? So all the folks that I knew that were in the contracting space, all of their jobs dried up. But I stayed in touch with a couple of them. And right around September timeframe, when I was saying, okay, they moved me to HR, I gotta go. A couple of them said, hey, we're getting more work than we can because people are not, these companies don't know what to do after George Floyd. And so that's when I decided, okay, let me do this. I left, let's say September 1st, with the idea that I was going to take 2 months off and not start this company until like November, December timeframe. I had my first client by September 5th. And I have not had to market. I have not had to look for any clients since then. So because there are lots of folks that just don't know what to do in this space. One, and two, there are a lot of self-proclaimed DEI professionals that have just shown up, and companies have paid them and they're realizing these folks don't know what they're doing.
Thank you for that answer. And that was actually, you hit on something that I was really interested in, and that was companies, especially in light of the incident with regards to George Floyd, the more recent incident with regards to enhanced violence against those of Asian descent. It seems as though diversity is a big topic of discussion. And so I was curious, right? A lot of companies are claiming that they already have systems in place and that this is something they've always kind of been dedicated to. But I was curious as to whether or not that was actually the case. And you really touched on that well. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? It looks like we have time for maybe one or two more. No more questions? And then I'm going.
I have a question, but it's easier to ask it as opposed to type it.
That's fine.
What is an example or the example of the greatest turnaround you've seen in a company that had issues, took consulting in the direction that you teach, or some friends and colleagues, and then they saw a turnaround within their organization? I'm assuming for the better. Hopefully it didn't get worse. Did you have an example of where things went significantly to the upside?
I have a current client where it's still in process, right? I'll say that. So this is a client that's a nonprofit in New York that works with kids. Most of the kids that they work with are Black and Latino. And so they initially came to say, like, hey, we want to make sure that we're an anti-racist organization. Okay, great. So we did a couple workshops with them. And after I do this kind of like, we truncated it to a 2-hour workshop, but after doing that with their board of directors, one of their head of HR and culture came in and said, I had an aha moment. We have good intentions, but when I look at our leadership, it's basically all white men, right? And they're like, we're doing all of this stuff externally. We're not doing this stuff internally. And so the work that I'm doing with them right now is how to really take this to be a part of their company DNA, right? So it's not taking power from anyone, but like, how do you shift the culture so that the folks that you are impacting are also part of the decision-making process too. And so we're going through that process right now. But from the time that I first started talking and working with them to now, you can see how they're approaching things very differently, right? Like, okay, we don't have these voices at the table, or wow, we have this budget, but no one that's impacted by the work of this budget has any say, right? So they're really taking a deep dive into how they can be more inclusive as a leadership team and as a board. So that's the example that I can give right now, but they're still in process.
Thanks.
Yep.
Any more last questions? Okay, well, we're almost to the end of our time anyway, so I just want to thank you again, Sacha, for sharing with us today and for all of your insight and for graciously dedicating your time to us. As we know, you're very busy as a founder and the entrepreneurship world is always going. But for everyone else, I did put the check-in form and the new member form in the chat. However, it seems that Microsoft Forms is down right now. So don't worry about that. I'll make sure everyone gets their points. But I just want to thank you all for joining us. And if you are a new member or you're not a member and you're interested in getting connected with the center, you can message me or message me on LinkedIn. I'll also be sticking around for about 5 more minutes if you have any questions about that, so I can get that sorted out for you. Or if you want to be connected with Sacha, I can stay after and get that figured out as well. So yeah, thank you again, Sacha, and thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope you all have a great weekend and a great Easter if you celebrate. And we hope to see you all tomorrow at Rocket Pitch at 2 p.m. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for having me.